All right, Shabbosai, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors. To thank our TALMUD TORAH sponsors for the month of Kislev. Haba Alinu Latova, Josh Becca Friedman, in creation of the yahrzeit of Josh's father, Yisroel Yehuda ben HaRav Chaim Rephael, and the aliyah for the Neshama of those killed Al Kiddush Hashem on October 7th, as well as the zechus for the safe return of our soldiers and all of the hostages. To thank Sammy and Malka Esterson for dedicating over Sherman Joshos this month in memory of their parents, Hinda Esterson, Hinda Bas Henoch Ephraim, Ludwig Stiefel, Yitzchok Leib ben Aaron HaKohen, Sarah Stiefel, Sarah Rachel Bas Baruch Avram Zichron Livracha, the Pepper family in memory of our brother and uncle Yosef Pepper, Yosef David ben Yaakov Zichron Livracha, and of course as a shir we dedicate our learning this month Le'iloi Nishmas Master Sergeant Eliyahu Michal Harush Hashem Yikom Dama. We hope that in the merit of all of our Torah, in merit of all of the Neshama will have an aliyah, the families in Neshama, and halavai Yisroel Tovos for all of Klal Yisrael. With that, let us begin. We have a beautiful, beautiful daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Yud Dalet. Yeah, Yud Dalet. Good. Yud Dalet 14. We are picking up Emir Hashem on Yud Gimel Amud Beis at the two dots. Chutz mirshus hamiyuchad lamazik. That's where we left off yesterday. So the Gemara says as follows. So if you remember again, so the Mishnah quoted right across from Tosas Kegon Shekibel. So the Gemara is quoting from the Mishnah that ultimately again one is chayiv for liability. When one damages, there is liability for damages that are done, except if damage was done in the domain of the mazik, of the damager. So for example, if Ruvain walks into my domain and he gets damaged on my property, I am not liable for that. When I say him, I mean like Yishar, he's not liable. I'm not liable for that. The Gemara says, why? Because like I said, Ruvain, why is your ox in my domain? Now, again, we're going to talk about this. This case actually has a number of very interesting ramifications in some other directions as well, which is this presupposes that Ruvain's ox is not invited into my domain. But what happens if Ruvain's ox is invited in? I allow Ruvain and his property to enter. We'll discuss cases like that. But by Pashtos, if ultimately again damage occurs in the property of the damager, then ultimately again I am exempt. Furthermore, this is actually interesting. The Mishnah says that if damage occurs in a domain, which sounds like it's the domain of both the damaged party and the damager, there's also exemption there. Now, what does this mean? Says the Gemara, they both say this is fascinating. What happens if Reuven and Shimon own property jointly, and they're both in that joint property with, again, their respective oxen, their respective shvarim, and what happens? Reuven's ox damages Shimon's ox, again, in the jointly held field. What's the halacha there? So the Rav Chisda said, chayiv ba'ala shin ba'ala regal. One is chayiv for shein and for regal. Now we'll say, now remember again, let's take a step back over for just a moment. Shein, remember again, what's shein? Damage done while in the course of the animal receiving hana, benefit, right? Regal, damage done during the course of activities of daily living. Now, here's what's interesting. The way the Torah frames the damage done of shein and regel is that the animal goes ubir b'stei acher. Ubir b'stei acher. So the way the Torah frames it is damage happens in another field. So what Rav Chisda is saying is jointly held property still satisfies the criteria of another field. Since there's another owner, someone else is involved in the ownership, that's still called another field. Now Rashi points out over here that obviously if you're going to be chayiv for shein and regel, you're going to be chayiv, of course, for Karen as well, right? Karen doesn't need to be mentioned. Because remember again, Karen itself, interestingly enough, you're even chayiv in Rosh Hashanah. Right, which of course is interesting because halach l'maisa Rosh Hashanah is free for all. Everyone's allowed to be there, right? But l'maisa, if you're even chayav for Karen and Rosh Hashanah, so obviously we see that Karen damage doesn't really matter whether which domain you're in is going to be liability. So I'll say that's the position of Rav Chisda and Rav Avimi. Okay, v'achik karev is what the Mishnah means to say. Chutz merishos hamiyuchades l'mazik. The Pater. The Mishnah is coming to teach me that yes, if damage occurs in the damager's property, then the damager will be Pater, because as we said before, the damager could say to the damagee, what are you doing in my property? However, Urushos hanizak. Sorry. Urushos hanizak v'amazik kishezik chavamazik. But if damage occurs in jointly owned property, then ultimately again there will be liability. So we'll say this is the opinion of Rav Chisda that halacha l'maaseh, if damage occurs in jointly owned property, one is chayav for shein, regel, and keren. Incredible. Rabbi Elazar says, "Patra ala shein v'ala regel." No, not true. Not true. Ultimately, again, if again Reuven and Shimon jointly own property, and Reuven's ox damages Shimon's ox with shein or with regel in the jointly owned property, ultimately Reuven is going to be pater. What's the logic? V'hachik kamar chutz mirishus hamiyuchedes lamazik. Urishus hanizak v'amazik nami pater. So therefore, Rabbi Elazar will say, not only are you pater if damage is done in the damager's property, but even if damage is done in jointly owned property. Ukishehizik chav hamazik lasuye keren. And ultimately, again, Rabbi Elazar say when the Mishnah says that phrase. So Rabbi Elazar say, by the way, what's Rabbi Elazar's logic? Rabbi Elazar's logic is jointly owned property does not satisfy the biblical criteria of ubir b'stei acher. Stei acher means property that is not owned by either of them. Not owned by either of them. But if the property is jointly owned, then or is the domain ultimately of the damager, then halacha l'maisa there will not be liability in said case. Interesting. Now, what about when the Mishnah says the phrase ukishehizik chav hamazik? Right, and the Mishnah says again that ultimately again when damage was done, the damager is obligated. What does that come to include? Lasuye keren. That comes to include the case of keren. Okay, if you look at Rashi says kishehizik. It's almost right across in Rashi. Kishehizik chavamasik lasuye keren. Rabbi Elazar di imishum meitov hatana lereisha el lasuye keren dechayiv alav delo tanya leel behat b'skut. So therefore, the Mishnah is coming to teach me that there's liability for keren. Now, let's remember again. This is already our second Mishnah of Bava Kama. Why is the Mishnah here teaching me that there's liability for keren? Watch this. Going back a little bit of a chazar from the past. So Hanicha Shmuel. So I'll say this makes sense according to Shmuel. When I remember again, what did Shmuel say? Shmuel said that in the previous Mishnah, Shar ultimately again was regel, and Maveh was shein. According to Shmuel, this makes sense because now our Mishnah is introducing keren liability. Beautiful. El Rav Damar Tana Shar Chamili Deshar. So I will say, but according to Rav, who said that Shar in the first Mishnah, he said that Shar included what? Keren, shein, and regel. If that's the case, then ultimately again, Chava Mazek La Suye Mai. So we'll say, what is that phrase? Ultimately again of Chava Mazek, that there's liability for the damager. What does that come to include? We'll say first wide line, bottom of 13b. So the Gemara's La Suye. This is very interesting. It comes to include the following cases. Watch this. The Gemara says, the Tanrabanan. So the Gemara says, I'm sorry. So we'll say that phrase, that ultimately, again, when damage is done, the damager is liable. It comes to include a whole host of other cases. What cases? Shomer Chinam, unpaid custodian, shoel, borrower, no say schar, paid custodian, socher, renter. In all of these cases, shezika behima birshusan, if an animal was damaged while the animal was under their watch, then what's the halacha? Tam mishalim chatzi nezek. Ultimately, again, if it's a tam, pay half damages, right? Muad mishalim nezek shalim. If it's a muad, pays complete damages. However, nifrat sabalayla, if the animal somehow escaped its pen at night, shepartsuha, listen, nifrat sabalayla really means actually the wall, like the pen came down at night, or thieves went ahead and breached the wall, and as a result, the animal gets out and does damage. Ultimately, again, pater. Then these individuals, all of these custodians, will be pater. Okay, so we'll say, so we have no idea what that. We just read the words, but what the case is, it's not clear. We'll have to see in just a moment. So let's analyze this. So we just said before that when the Mishnah says the phrase kishehizik chav hamazik, that when damage is done, ultimately the damager is liable. What does that come to include? Lahavi shomer chinam, hashoel no se schar vasocher. Fine. Sehechi dami. What's the case? What's the case? So I understand what the Gemara is trying to teach me. The Gemara is trying to teach me that halacha l'maisa, when ultimately, again, the animal is under the care of any, or under the watch of any of these individuals, if damage occurs, these individuals will be chayiv. What's the case? What's the case? Ilema da'aski toward the mashil, toward the shoel. It's interesting. So I'll say, if it's a case of where, let's say again, you have a borrower, right? So Reuven borrowed my ox. Say if it's a case of where my ox, in other words, the ox that Reuven borrowed from me, damaged his ox, so is there liability in that case? Leimale, I could say to him, Ilu azik ba'alma ba'is l'shalume at, right? Hashta da'aske l'tura didach ba'inu l'shalume. So I can say, Reuven, I'm not responsible for this, because had my ox damaged someone else while under your care, you'd be responsible. So now that my ox is damaging your ox, you're still responsible. In other words, why that's not on me. Ela da'aski toward the shoel, toward the mashal. Rather, it must be that what? I gave my ox to Reuven to watch, and Reuven's ox damaged my ox that he's watching. So the Gemara said, if that's the case, Leimalei, ilu itzik me alma bais the shalume kule tura, hashta da'aski tura didach, palga nezika, hudim shalvasli. So once again, I'll say there'd be liability regardless. In other words, in whatever case, ultimately, again, of shul you want to talk. So whether it's a case of, I lent Reuven my ox, right? He borrowed my ox. So whether it's a case of my ox damaging one of his oxen, or his ox damaging one of my oxen, he's a shoel. As a shoel, there's complete liability. So what's the case? Li'olam da'aski toward the mashil, toward the shoel. But say here's the case. In reality, what happens? I lent Reuven my ox, and my ox went ahead and damaged Reuven's ox. So the Gemara says, okay, Hacham Askinon, what's the case? Shekibel alav shmiras gufo. The case is where Reuven accepted upon himself responsibility that my ox will not damage anyone else's ox, top of Yudalid, but lo kibel alav shmiras nizakov. But ultimately, again, Reuven did not take responsibility if my ox should damage someone else's ox. So therefore, again, perhaps one can make the argument that, and again, these were the terms of the borrowing. These were the terms. I mean, they were the agreed upon terms. Therefore, when my ox ends up damaging Reuven's ox, technically speaking, there's going to be liability on my part for that. Okay, interesting. If that's the case, what about the end of the brayso that says, Nifra sabalayla, if let's say the pen is breached at night, right, part of the wall falls down, O sheper to listim, or supposed to say second line on 14a, or thieves breach through, the the animal gets out and does damage, potter. So the Gemara says, now interesting enough, habayom chayiv. Now what's interesting is, it sounds like this is only true at night, right? Because at night, again, Reuven was sleeping. He didn't see what was going on, so he can't be held liable. However, again, it sounds like if this happened by day, there would be liability. But one second, you just said before that we're talking about a case that what? Halo kibel alav shmiras nezakov. You just framed this as a case of where what? Reuven, the borrower, accepted responsibility for damage that happens to the borrowed animal, but not for damage that the borrowed animal performs. So what's going on? To which the Gemara says, you're right, Tachi Kamar. Im kibel alav shmiras nezakov chayiv. If ultimately, again, if Reuven went ahead and accepted upon himself responsibility for the damage that the animal does, then ultimately he'll be chayiv. Nifra sabalayla o sheper tzua listim yatsav ezika pater. But even in that case, if the wall is breached at night or thieves get in at night and therefore the animal gets out, ultimately Reuven will be pater. Okay, interesting. So the Gemara says, Allah l'maisa, is this true? Is this true that ultimately, again, that Allah l'maisa, if my shard did damage, right? Ultimately, again, if the shard did damage with now we'll say, let's take a step back for just a moment. The point of contention in all of this was what happens if a shard does damage in jointly owned property, right? So Reuven and Shimon own property together, right? And now Reuven's shar does damage to Shimon's shar in the form of Shane or Regel. By the way, I should take it back. It doesn't have to be that Reuven's shar does damage to Shimon's shar. It's that Reuven's shar does damage to Shimon's property, whatever the property is, with Shane or with Regel in jointly owned property. So Gemara is operating under the assumption that halacha l'maisa, that there is liability. So is that true? Gemara says, "V'ha tani Rav Yosef." Listen to this. Chasra shutfin va'pondak chayiv b'hain alashin v'ala regel. So I'll say, see here you see quite explicitly, right? Rav Yosef says that if you have jointly owned property, jointly owned chatzar, or a pundak, We'll say pundak is an inn. Rashi points out over here, pundak is bayis gadol sherigilin archin vachsina lalan ba. It's a large structure, right? A large place that ultimately guests tend to stay. From hizik chayiv ashin v'regel. I will say, interesting enough, like a pundak, right? And in a hotel could also be considered to be like a chaser shel shutzin, right? Everyone has the right to be there, and kind of has like a joint ownership there. So watch this. Shav Yosef says, chaser shutzin v'pundak chayiv banal shein b'al regel. Ultimately, you're chayiv for shein and regel. So we'll say, what do you see from here? Tiyufta the Rebbe Lazar. So Rebbe Lazar, this obviously refutes the position of Rebbe Lazar, because Rebbe Lazar said there is no liability for shein and regel performed in jointly owned property. Here you see there is. So the Gemara says, Tiyufta Rebbe Lazar, Amar Rebbe Lazar, v'tizbara masnisa milo pligi. We'll say, but one second, doesn't the Mishnah itself argue? The Brisa itself argue about Tanya. We learned this is interesting. Arba klalos chayyar Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer ben Azigin. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar said there were four klalos, four principles said when it comes to damages. Number one, kol shurishus lenizak v'lo lamazik chayi bakol. So we'll say any time that you're talking about a situation where damage was done in the property of the damaged party, and the property does not belong to the damager, chayiv bakol. Ultimately, again, the damager is chayiv for everything. Now, we'll see exactly what that means, the chayiv for everything. Okay, next. Chayiv bakol. Dimasik v'lo l'nizak. If the property belongs to the damager and not to the damagee, pater mikol. Then ultimately, again, the damager is pater from everything. Well, so we saw that before. Why is he pater from everything? Because what could the damager say? What do you do with my property? Okay, that's case number 2. Lezeh. What happens if the property is jointly owned? So chatzar shutzvin va'bika pater ala shein v'ala regel. All right. So now here you have this brisa that says if it's jointly owned property, then what? Then you're pater on shein and on regel. All right. So the Gemara says, al hanigicha, v'al hanigifa. So we'll say when it comes to biting, when it comes ultimately again to pushing, or negicha is goring, right? Neshicha biting, al revitza, squatting on, be'ita kicking. So the halach is tam mishalim chatzi nezek. If it's a tam, it pays half damages. Muad mishalim nezek shalim. Ultimately, muad pays complete damages. Lo lazeh v'lo lazeh. What happens if the property belongs to neither of them? Kigon. Chazer she'eno shel shnehem. Right? Either, again, I will say that could be a chazer that doesn't belong to either of them. Chayiv al hashein v'al haregel. Chayiv al hashein v'al haregel. One's chayiv for shein and for regel. Al hanegicha, v'al haneshicha, v'al hanegifa, v'al haritza. So remember again, this is all Karen. Vala bi'ita. So we'll say, so again, if the damaging animal either went ahead and gored, or bit, or pushed, or squatted on, or kicked, tam mishalim chazi nezek, muad mishalim nezek shalim. Ultimately, again, I will say, tam, half damages, muad, complete damages. Good. We'll say, now what was the point of that? Now, we're going to dissect that brisa a little bit, but for our purposes, what was the point of that entire brisa? Katani mihas, first wide line, I will say, on 14a. Katani mihas, Hashutfin, Chatzar Shutfin, Va'bika, Pater Ba'ala Shin V'ala Regel. Let's say, again, the Ikar part we brought that price. It's Chatzar Shal Shutfin. Ultimately, again, you're exempt for Shein and Regel. So we'll say, Kasha Ahadadi. So we see now that we have conflicting brisos, which on one hand is good news. Why is it good news? Because again, it reinforces the fact that this whole thing is a machlokis between Rav Chisda and Rav Elazar. Right? Remember, this is how this whole thing started. If damage is done in jointly owned property, is the damager chayiv for shein and regel? Rav Chisda says yes, that's called stei acher, that's called another field. Rav Elazar says no, it's not called another field. So the same way there's machlok is also contradictory brises. To which the Gemara says no, it's not a contradiction. First wide line, I will say, first wide line, 14a ends of the first wide line. Kitan yahin. Now second wide line, bechatzer miyuchedes lazeh ulazeh bein leperos ubein leshvarim. So we'll say, now watch this. This is interesting. So the Gemara suggests, when do we say that halacha l'maisa, the brisa that says that you're pater for shein and regel, in a jointly owned chatzar? So we'll say that's in a chatzar ultimately again, where both parties had permission to use it both for produce and livestock. for produce and livestock. Look at Rashi. Rashi says, almost like right across from Rashi, B'chatzim yichedes lezel lezeh, leperos l'shvarim, dahavi lechatzra shutvin legabi shein, or legabi karen, hilchach b'shein pater b'shus rabim, or b'karen tama, chatzin ez b'shus rabim shayim. So let's listen to this. Salocha l'maisa. This is talking about a case where you have the right to put both your produce as well as your oxen. So therefore, again, in this case, halacha l'maisa, you will be pater for shein. You'll be pater for shein because it's not called stei acher, right? It's not called another field. You have permission to be there, so it's not called another field. But ultimately, again, will be chayav for karen. Okay. So the Gemara says, Hy'd Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef's case is bechatzra miyuchades leperos ve'ena miyuchades leshvarim. Very interesting, I will say. The case ultimately of Rav Yosef is where you have permission ultimately again to keep, right? It's jointly owned, but the partners have permission to put their produce in there, but don't have permission to put their livestock, their oxen in there. So watch this. Delagabe Shein, Havili Chatzar Nizak. When it comes to Shein, it's considered to be privately owned property, and therefore, going to both say, remember, there is no liability for Shein done on privately owned property. I'm sorry, take a look at Rashi. Sorry, take that back. Rashi says over here, Rav Yosef Bechatzar Miyuchades, Davi Chatzar HaNizak. Therefore, it's considered to be the property of the damaged party. Shelo hayalo lahachnis sham shvarim. You're not allowed to bring an oxen over there. Therefore, v'lo dami l'rshus harabim. And ultimately, again, it's not comparable. Ultimately, again, to rshus harabim. So back to the Gemara. Ta'algabe shein. Therefore, for shein purposes, havili chatzar nizik is considered to be the property of the damaged party. Incredible. Dekanami diktani. So also you could see an inference, a diuk in this as well. Diktani hacha. Dumya de pundak. Because remember again, the Braisa goes in and compares it ultimately to a pundak, to an inn. The katani hasam dumya de bika. It says over there that is comparable ultimately again to a valley. Shmamina, indeed, you can see that this is the correct understanding. So ask the Rabbi Zera. The Bava says that's how the Gemara reconciles the contradiction between the Braisos. They're talking about different permissions in different cases. Maskil for Rabbi Zera. So 1 second. If we're talking about a case, ultimately again, of where halacha l'maisa, the both parties have right to keep their produce there. So how is there liability for shein? Because for shein, ultimately, you will say, what do you need? Ubir b'ste'acher. You need the damaging animal to wander into a different field. What does it mean in a different field? A field in which it does not have permission to be. But if it has permission to be there, or if the produce, so why is it called b'ste'er b'ste'acher? To which the Gemara says, Amrle Abaye, Kevan de'inim yuchedes l'shvarim. No. We'll say what makes it ste'acher is, even though it's jointly owned, if you don't have permission to bring your livestock in there, then what? Then regarding livestock, that's called what? Ste'acher. That's called another field. So ultimately, again, Sadar Achar Karina Bay. Beautiful. Amalei Rav Acha Midifti Ravina. Lema Timidimas Nisa Lo Pligi Amorai Nami Lo Pligi. So we'll say, since it turns out that the Brises are not contradicting each other, maybe ultimately, again, there's no machlokes Amoraim as well. Right? In other words, maybe there's no machlokes with Chistin of Elazar either. To which the Gemara says, Amalei in Tim Salamar Pligi, Bekushad Rabbi Zera or Bepiruki da Abayi de Pligi. So we'll say it's possible it's possible that they're talking about different kinds of cases, and maybe there is no machlokes. But Allah, and even if you say there is a machlokes, the machlokes ultimately is regarding the question of Rabbi Zera, and ultimately the subsequent answer of Abayi. Okay, so we'll say, so bottom line, the Gemara wants to suggest that maybe there is no machlokes over here, and maybe ultimately they're just talking about different kinds of cases. Okay, so that still remains unresolved. We will say what does come out from it, and this is why these Gemaras are so important, even though sometimes you get to the end of it, and so what happened here exactly? So we'll say the reason why it's important is because even if it's not conclusive in the particular cases, what we do pick up along the way are some very important morsels or nuggets of information. So we'll say, so what do we pick up over here? We picked up over here is this idea that in order for there to be shein and regel liability, it's beautiful. So, all right, in order for there to be, just when you think you've heard every ringtone, right? So in order for there to be shein and regel liability, remember again, where does it have to happen? This is an important idea. Where does it have to happen? It has to happen b'ste'acher. in a different field. So we'll say, and this kind of comes together with everything we've seen up until now. So for example, I will say, if halacha l'maisa, damage occurs in the property of the damager, there's no liability, right? Why is there no liability? In general, there's no liability because the damager could say, what are you doing here? What are you doing here, right? Who invited you here? So I didn't ask you to be here, so therefore there's no liability. Obviously, again, if damage occurs in the property of the damagee, of course there's going to be liability. The interesting tension that comes up is in jointly owned property, because here's what we know. Shein and regel, there's only liability ultimately, again, if it occurs in the other's field. Stay acher, in the other's field. Right? Karen, there's going to be liability anywhere in someone else's field. But remember, Karen is unique because since Karen is aggressive behavior, which is considered to be somewhat abnormal, so therefore, again, Allah might say Karen is liability even in Rosh Hashanah, in public domain. So again, just hold on to these morsels because we're going to plug them in at different points. So let's go back there. Says the Gemara, Gufa. So we'll say, now let's go back and dissect the brisa that we mentioned before. So Gufa, Arba Klalos Hayar Rabbi Shimon Elazar Omer. Rabbi Shimon Elazar said there are four principles, or really four categories, bin Ezekin. So also remember again, category number, or principle number one, Kol Shurushus Lenizak V'lo Lamazik, Chayi Bakol. Anytime damage occurs in the damaged party's property, complete liability. Chayiv Bakol. So also the Gemara says, interestingly enough, Al Hakol Lo Katani, it doesn't say you're chayiv for everything. Rather, what does it say? Chayiv Bakol. You are chayiv Bakol. What does Bakol mean? Bekulein has complete damages. Complete damages. So I will say what that seems to indicate to us is that when damage is done in the damaged party's premises, right? So Reuven's animal goes into Shimon's field and damages. So we'll say, now remember, for Shein and Regel, an animal is muad from the beginning. Right? So there's no such thing as chas, there's no such thing as partial damages by Shein and Regel. By Shein and Regel, that's quote unquote normal damage, complete liability from the beginning. What's the only area of damage where there's a distinction between half damages and whole damages? Where? Karen. Right? Karen, if you're a first time or second time, right? Or I'll call it a tam, chatzi nezek, a muad, nezek shalim. So what's intriguing over here is as follows. The Gemara seems to say over here, Rabbi Shimon Elazar is saying that Allah L'maisa, if Reuven's animal goes into Shimon's field and does Karen damage, it's the principle is Chayiv Bakol. Bakol makes it sound like that. It's what? Nezek Shalim. Nezek Shalim. So the Gemara says, so B'kulei Nezek, who says this? So the Rabbi Tarfani Da'amar Mishuna Karen B'Nezek B'Chatzah Nizak Nezek Shalim Mishalim. Rabbi Tarfani will say that Mishuna Karen means a unique case of Karen. A unique case of Karen that occurs ultimately again in the damaged party's property. You automatically pay complete damage. So I will say the Mishuna Karen means abnormal Karen. The truth is Karen is always abnormal. Karen is always abnormal. Now, how do we know that Karen is abnormal? That's why halacha l'maisa, you only pay half damages, right? If it was normal for an animal to exhibit aggressive behavior, then it would just be like Shein and Regel, and you'd pay 100% damages from the outset. So Mishuna Karen is like a description of the nature of Karen itself. But Rabbi Tarfon says, here's what's interesting. When do you pay half damages? Half damages is when the animal damages in Rosh Hashanah. But if my animal damages Reuven's animal, or Reuven's animal in Reuven's property, Nezek Shalim, complete damages. Incredible. But say, take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says over here, it's the last part of the first wide line of Rashi. Mishuna Karen b'chatzar Nezek Shalim Mishalim, Karen Tama, v'chol do dosea, Karen Mishuna, Hoil v'shino es veston shelo hayu darken lekach. So I will say, so it's interesting. So Karen Mishuna is not when you look at it, you're like, oh, this is a new category of Karen. It's not a category of Karen. It's just a description of Karen. I will say, it's an interesting idea that Karen. So Karen is Rashi's Lashon Hara is actually very interesting. Rashi says, Hoil v'shino es veston. The animal changed its vesas, not like a din and hilchos nida over here, right? The animal should, right? What's a vesas? A vesas is a cycle, right? The animal changed its normal behavior. So I will say, the nature of people, the nature of beings, is to be b'shalom. This is a very important idea. It's to be b'shalom. The Baruch Hu created humanity, and the Baruch Hu created the animal kingdom, right? To exist b'shalom. That's the default. That's the default. Karen activity, aggressive behavior that goes ahead and hurts another, that's a shinui vesas. That's a change in the temperament. That's a change in the cycle. Which Shabbos say, is such, and what's true of the animal kingdom, alachas kama v'kamo, is true for man. We'll say the natural state, even if we just apply this to Klal Yisrael, the natural state of Klal Yisrael is to be b'shalom. That's the natural state. Where there is infighting, where there is disagreement, where there is machlokes, that is a shinui vesas. That is a change and an aberration from the norm. You know what our national challenges? Our national challenges, after 2,000 years of kind of being at each other, so we think machlokes is the norm, and like shalom is there. Let's say, I'll tell you something interesting. Right now, we're living in such a time of shalom, right? And it feels so unique. Isn't it sad? On one hand, it's beautiful. Shalom is beautiful. Isn't it sad that shalom feels so unique? Right? People are like, wow, this is great. And as if like we discovered something, right? We discovered something called shalom, which is beautiful that we've discovered shalom. We should hold on to it in Meretz Hashem until Mashiach turns it into a permanent state for us. Absolutely. Absolutely. But there's a sadness that like we feel we struck gold, that like we had found something that we never had before. It shows us to a certain degree how broken things were, that now we feel that we've stumbled upon this new thing called shalom that no one ever discovered. Again, Baruch Hashem, we stumbled upon it. Tragic how we stumbled upon it, but I'm here to hold on to it. But it's interesting, just even Karen is called Mishuna Karen. Aggressive behavior towards the other, even in the animal kingdom, it's Mishuna. It's not the control of the world. In any event, so what's Rabbi Tarfon holds that when Karen is done in the Rishus HaNizak, ultimately, again, there's nezek shalim. I'm safe. I'll look at the end. Lo lazeh v'lo lazeh. What if damage is done in the property that doesn't belong to either of them? Kigon chazer she'eno shel shnehem. For example, like I will say, if you have a chaz that doesn't belong to either of them, chayiv ba'ala shein v'ala regal. Ultimately, again, there will be liability for both shein and regal. So what does it mean? My lo lazeh v'lo lazeh. What does it mean? Property that doesn't belong to Reuven or to Shimon. Ilema lo lazeh v'lo lazeh klal ela da'acher. So ultimately, again, if you want to say that it doesn't belong to either of them, right, but rather it belongs to Levi, so that doesn't work. In other words, we'll say the way that Shein and Regal damage works is Reuven's ox goes into Shimon's property. That's the way that it works. The Gemara says, if it's a third party's property, then there's no Shein and Regal liability. Ela pshita lo lazeh v'lo lazeh ela dichad. Rather, it must be that it doesn't belong to both Reuven and Shimon. Rather, it only belongs to Shimon. So that's an interesting way to word it. So, v'katani seifa tam b'shalim chazi nezek umur b'shalim nezek shalim. Now, we'll say then it says in that case where Karen damage is done in the property of the nizak, that you only pay chatzi nezek for Karen for a tam and nezek shalim for a muad. Sasan l'Rabbanan, that goes according to Rabbanan. The Amri mishuna Karen b'chatzar nizek chatzi nezek udu b'shalim. Shabbos say. So listen to this in the Bryce itself. I would say I just want to point out to you this is riveting. So get ready for this. I would say there's a fundamental machlokes Rabbi Tarfon and the Rabbanan about Karen done b'shus hanizak. Let's go through what everybody agrees with. Everyone agrees that if Reuven's ox, Gor Shimon's ox, and Shtarabim, right? Karen and Shtarabim, what's the halacha? Tam, Chatzi Nezek, Muad, Nezek Shalim. First time offender or whatever. Not Muad, half damages. Yes, Muad, right? Habitual offender, complete damages. The machlokes is what happens if Reuven's ox does Karen damage to Shimon's ox in Shimon's property. Rabbi Tarfon says, Karen in the property of the damagee, complete damages. Mishuna Karen bechatzar hanizak nezek shalim. Rabbanan say no. Karen is Karen. Whether Karen is done in the property of the damaged party, the nizak, or Karen is done in Rishus Harabim, halocha lemaisa chatzi nezek for tam, nezek shalim for more. Rabbanan say the problem is that the Brisa seems to reflect both views. Reish Rabbi Tarfon say for Rabbanan. That's the way it's going to work. The Reisha reflects the view of Rabbi Tarfon, the Seifa is the Rabbanon. The Gemara says, in Daha Amar Shmuel Rabbi Yehuda. Shmuel Silber, Rabbi Yehuda, Shilina, Shavot Masnisin Vita Abasroi. So Abasroi, so go ahead and leave aside the Mishnah, right, and follow the Brisa. Reish Shavitarfon Sefer Rabbanon. Good. Shmuel said yes. So although we don't ideally like that, that's the way this is set up. So the Gemara says, Ravina Mishneh the Rava Amar Kulu Rabbi Tarfon. No, it's not true. The entire Brisa reflects Rabbi Tarfon. Umay lo lazeh, my lo lazeh. The lo lazeh. What does it mean when the Brisa says a property that doesn't belong to this one, doesn't belong to that one? So the Gemara says lazeh, the lo lazeh leperos, ela dechad lazeh ulazeh l'shvarim. So I'll say ultimately, what are we talking about? We're talking about ultimately again where only one of them had the right to store produce there, but both of them had the right to bring in livestock. To lagabe shein, therefore for shein purposes, havile chatzar hanizak. For shein purposes, is considered to be the domain of the damaged party. Lagabe keren, havile rishus harabim. But for Karen, since they both had rights to be there, it's called Rishos Harabim. Ihachi, if that's the case, Arba Shlosha Habu. If that's the case, then there aren't 4 cases, or 4 principles, that there are only 3. Says, on the days, Shlosha Kolonos, Varim Makamos. There are 3 principles that ultimately, again, are espoused in 3 different places. All right, incredible. Shabbos say, so what, by the way, Haloch L'Maisa, this is very exciting. So we'll say, so again, so now we've seen the halacha l'maisa. In order for shein and regel, ultimately, again, for there to be liability, it has to be stei acher. It has to be someone else's field, right? The damaged party's field can't be jointly owned. We also see that if damage done in the damager's field, ultimately, again, no liability. Damager says, what are you doing here? What about the halacha of keren done birshus hanizak? So what happens, we'll say, if Reuven's ox damages Shimon's, gores Shimon's ox, Karen damage, where? In Shimon's property. In Shimon's property. What is the halacha in that case? Shabbos say we pass like the Rabbanon, that is still tam chatzi nezek, muad nezek shalom. So in other words, we don't distinguish between Karen done in Rishos Harabim versus Karen done in the damaged party's property. The halacha is always going to be the same. Absolutely incredible. Mishnah will say, Mishnah Yadam base 14b, new Mishnah. Always excited to get to a new Mishnah. Right? Feel like a little bit of like a schachos, like a Baal Tshuva. You know, it's like a new beginning, a new start. The Mishnah says as follows: Shum Kesef. The only problem is we have no idea what this Mishnah is saying. Shum Kesef. It's actually a strangely worded Mishnah, which I have to use the Gemara for. Shum Kesef, literally again, something that is worth money. Shava Kesef, something that is valued as money. Bifnei Bezdin, has to be done in front of Bezdin. Ba'al Pi Eidim B'nei Chorin, and in front of Eidim B'nei Chorin, who are free people. B'nei Bris, members of the covenant. V'anoshim B'chlal HaNezek, women are included in damages. V'anizak v'amasik v'tashlumin, and the damaged party and the damager in repayment. Strangest Mishnah ever. So the Gemara says, what are you talking about? My shum kesef. We'll say, what does that mean? Something. Shum literally means like a valuation or an appraisal. Shum kesef. Am Yehuda shum zeh lo yehe ela b'kesef. Okay, what does it mean? We'll say, now we're talking about again how you pay damages. So when you evaluate damages are evaluated in money. In money, what does that mean? What else would it be? What else? What else? And apples? Like what else are you paying in? So we'll say, now watch. It's actually very interesting. So we'll say, imagine you have a cow that damaged a cloak, right? Utalis shezika para, or a cloak that damaged the cow. Okay, so the first part I understand, right? A cow goes ahead and let's say tramples on a cloak or soils the cloak, so he damages the cloak. What's the case of a cloak damaging a cow? The cow walked over the cloak and what happened? Slipped and broke its leg. Right? Broke its leg because of the cloak. What's the halacha? Ein omrim teitze para b'talis. B'talis para. So we'll say, so interesting. You might have thought, well, look, this is what we should do. If the cow damages the cloak, so what we should just do is give the owner of the cloak the cow. And if the cloak damaged the cow, give the owner of the cloak, give the owner of the cow the cloak. We don't say that. Interesting that the Gemara is like a halamina that we would say that, right? We don't say that. Ella shamin osav damin. Rather, we'll say, what do we look at? We look at how much damage was done, and how do we assess the amount of damage that was done? Money, right? That's it. All right. Just simply again, ultimately money. So we'll say, so that's the Gemara's understanding. The first statement of shum kesef means when we look at damages, we don't simply do a swap, right? We don't simply do a swap of objects. Rather, again, we assess the damages in dollars, in financial amount. Shava kesef, what does this mean? We'll say shava kesef means something worth money. So shum kesef means we evaluate damages in monetary terms. Shava kesef, something worth money. What does this mean? What does this mean? So the Gemara says, the Tan Rabbanan, listen to this. Shava kesef, what does it mean that it's worth money? Melamed, this is interesting. She'ein bezdin niskakin ela l'nechasim sheish l'nachrayis. So Rabbi says it's fascinating. So what it teaches us is, I will say that, so now, let's, Ruvain damaged Shimon. So I will say, so now let's say Ruvain did $5,000 worth of damage to Shimon. So now Bezdin, when they're going to go and assess damages, what do they assess damages against? Ruvain's real property. Nechasim sheish l'nachrayis, which also means what? Which means what? Land. When assessing damages or collecting damages, the first thing we go after is real estate. Avalam kadam nizak v'tafas metaltalin bezin govelamen. We'll say, but let's say you have a case, right? Ruvain damaged Shimon. There's $5,000 worth of damages. Now the Gemara says, shava kesef. First thing we collect is something worth money. What's the item worth money? Real estate. The first thing Bezdin seizes is real property. However, if Shimon went ahead and ended up, Shimon, the damaged party, seized metaltalin from Ruvain, so we'll say, let's say again, I don't know, so Shimon went over to Ruvain's house, or Shimon had in his possession Ruvain's object, Ruvain's, tractor mower, right? Tractor mower. Tell me you never wanted a tractor mower, right? So right, he seized Ruvain's, right? Or he had borrowed the previous week, he had borrowed Ruvain's tractor mower, right? So now it's in his garage. So he decides, you know what? I'm not giving it back. I'm selling it off, right? Or I'm keeping it. It's worth $5,000. So if he seized it, we won't take it away from him. In other words, fine, you took that in satisfaction of the debt. We'll just leave it at that. Fine. Shava kesef ki kesef. So we'll say, so therefore again, that's what shum kesef. So that's shum kesef. Next. So Amar, shava kesef. What does shava kesef mean? Melamed she'ein bezdin niskakin elin nechazir sheish l'nachrayis. So we'll say, so remember again, the Bryce Mar is recording this now. So now you're saying shava kesef means that, right? So shum kesef means, in general, when damage is done, we evaluate damages in terms of dollars, in terms of money. And now, what does Bezdin sees in satisfaction of damages done from Ruvain to Shimon? Real property. We go after real estate first. So the Gemara says, my mashma, where do you get that from the lashon of shum kesef or shava kesef? Sorry. So Amar Rabba Bar Ula davar hashava kol kesef. We seize something that is worth money. Mainihu. What does that refer to? Davar she'ein lo ona. It refers to something for which the halachos of ona don't apply. And I will say, now what does this mean? Ona, remember what's ona? Ona is the concept of overcharging. In general, if you overcharge or undercharge by more than a sixth or less, right, the transaction itself is batal. I will say, interestingly enough, the one thing, although it's not really one thing, I was going to say in just a moment, but ona doesn't apply to real estate. It's interesting, right? Why doesn't ona apply to real estate? Because we know real estate is one of those things which has different values for different people. So that where there's a market price, but Lamaisa, it's always possible that people, quote unquote, overpay for real estate or underpay for real estate. So therefore, again, the Gemara is suggesting that shava kesef means something that is worth money, meaning it's not subject to the laws of ona. What does that refer to? Karka. That refers to karka. Okay, so the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says, 1 second. Avadim ushtaros nami ilan. But also we'll say slaves, right? Avadim, servants, and shtaros, buying documents also is not subject to ona. Ela amara baraula davar hanikna b'kesef. It refers to something which could be acquired by money. So we'll say, so ultimately, shava kesef means something that's acquired by money. The Gemara is suggesting what's acquired by money? Property, real property, right? Real estate. Whereas 1 second. Avadim ushtaros nami niknim b'kesef. But avadim and shtars could also be acquired by money. Aravashi shava kesef velo kesef. It means something worth money, but it's not money itself. That refers to real estate. 1 second. Vani kulu kesef ninu. All of these other items, Rabbi say, interestingly enough, they're money. Interestingly, Gemara suggesting they still have a quasi-din of currency. Avadim have a quasi-din of currency. A shtar has a quasi-din of currency. Real property has no din of currency at all. All right. So Rami Levi, Rami Levi Rav Yehuda Bar Chinanol, Rav Huna Brei Rav Yoshua, Tana Shava Kesef. What does it mean when it says Shava Kesef? Malami Shein Bezin Iskak in Lechasim Sheish Lanachlayis. Right? Ellen Chazvos teaches us that what? That Beis Din, right? When damages are done, the first thing that Beis Din goes after is real property. Right? Only go after real property. Ayva Tanya we learned Yashiv l'Rabbo Shava Kesef Afilu Subin. So we had this before. The pasuk says Yashiv, you have to repay damages. We learn from Yashiv that what? You could repay with anything. Even what? Even bran. They will say bran is just descriptive of what? Of like lowest grade stuff. Lowest grade stuff. So the Gemara says, see from that you don't have to repay with real estate. You can repay even with metalton, even lowest grade metalton. Hacham asking on what's the case here? Biyasmi. Interesting, I will say, biyasmi. I will say, now what is this? We were dealing with orphans. I will say, now what's the case of orphans? Look at the last short line in Rashi, biyasmi. Kaminon, di shavek lu avuan hamazik mikarkoi, gabi minayu. Aval mi metaltali lo, di metaltali diyasmi lo mishtavi. I will say, now watch this. Let's say Ruvain dies. Ruvain leaves behind children, right? And Ruvain also leaves behind debt. Leaves behind the debt, right? So now Ruvain, for example, Ruvain damaged someone, right? Or he owed money, doesn't really matter. But let's say he damaged someone, he owes money. Now I will say, in general, Yisomim are not responsible for the debts of their father. The only time that they are, I will say, is when those debts had a lien against real estate. Right? If the debt had a lien against real estate, then halacha l'maisa, you could seize that real estate, that encumbered real estate, from the estate of the Yisomim. That you are allowed to do. So the Gemara says as follows. So perhaps when we say that halacha l'maisa, you could that Beis Din first goes after real estate. What is that? So I will say. So remember again, what's our problem? Our problem here is you're telling me this whole time that when you collect for damages, ultimately again you're collecting from real property. But now, Yoshiv teaches me that what? When collecting from damages, you collect from what? Anything. Even subin, even bran. So how do you reconcile it? Gemara says, you're right. When we speak about going after real property first, what is that talking about? The Yisomim case. And in fact, the only way to go ahead and satisfy debt damages from a Yisomim is if there was a lien against real property. Biasmi. If that's the case, I'll say, if halacha l'maisa is Yisomim, then ema seifa in kadam kivdei nizak v'tafas metaltalin Beis govel mehen. Also, what did the Brisa say? The Brisa said that if Ruvain, the damaged party, goes in and seizes metaltalin, right, in satisfaction of the damages, then what? We don't extract it from him. But one second, but if it's talking about Yisomim, am I Beis govel mehen? So we'll say again, but if it's Yisomim, you're not allowed to seize metaltalin from Yisomim. The only thing you're allowed to take from Yisomim is karka. To which the Gemara says, Amrav Nachman, shetafas mechayim. No. The case of where you seize metaltalin of Osai is where what? Where the damaged party seized the metaltalin of Ruvain while Ruvain was still alive. Then in that case, Beis Din doesn't take it from him. But if Ruvain died, then the only thing we could collect from the Yisomim is from what? Real property. So we'll say, what comes out of here is something really interesting, which is halach l'maisa. The Gemara ends off as like this. When you damage someone, so damages can be collected from anything. Movable property, real property, that we learn from Yashiv. If Ruvain damaged Shimon, and then Ruvain dies, right? Ruvain dies, and now we want to collect from damages from the Yisomim, then Rabbi say, the only thing you can collect from is what? Is real property. Right? But halacha l'maisa, so that's the Yisomim case. That's only real property. But if Ruvain damaged Shimon, halacha l'maisa, we could collect from real property or from movable property. If the damaged party seized something in satisfaction of the damages, we don't extract that ultimately again from the damaged party. I'll say, but halacha l'maisa, we actually had this halacha before. Let me just quickly end with this. The Shulchan Aruch Paskins is Siman Taf Yutes. Sif Aleph. Remember again, the Shulchan Aruch Paskins that when it comes to damages, first we go after metaltalin. Right? Again, when it comes to damages, the first thing you collect from is from metaltalin, movable property. Only in the event that there's not enough metaltalin to satisfy damages, then and only then do we do what? Do we go after real property? So that's how the Shulchan Aruch Paskins. Shkoyach. All right, Chav on Zoom. Have a great day, everyone. Good to see everyone.